They cornered him. The sound of boots scraping against the floor mixed with the low rumble of laughter. The air inside the bar felt thick, thicker than the cigarette smoke that lingered and clung to every surface. It was a place where outsiders weren't welcome, and he knew that the moment he stepped through the door. But he needed water. Just one bottle, and he'd be gone. That was the plan. The man behind the counter didn't even acknowledge him at first. He wiped the same spot on the bar like it was a stain that wouldn't come out, eyes flicking toward the group of bikers in the corner. They were already watching. Already grinning. He could feel it without looking, but when he finally did, the weight of their stares hit him hard. "Lost?" one of them asked, leaning back in his chair. The others laughed, low and sharp. He ignored it, reaching for his wallet, but the tension in the room didn't let up. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The man stood up this time. The scrape of the chair against the floor sent a ripple of unease through the room. "We don't like strangers in here. Especially not ones like you." The words cut through him, but he didn't react. He'd heard it before. Too many times. Still, there was something about the way they said it, the confidence, the smugness, that made his stomach tighten. He placed the bottle of water on the counter, sliding a few bills across, but the bartender didn't take them. Instead, he stepped back. And then the biker was right there, his breath reeking of beer and smoke. "You deaf? I said we don't like your kind around here." The shove wasn't hard, but it was enough. Enough to make him stumble back a step. Enough to make the others stand up, their boots echoing like gunshots in the silence. He raised his hands, calm and steady. He didn't want trouble. Not here. Not like this. But it didn't matter. They wanted trouble. "Look at him," one of them said, circling like a predator. "Thinks he's too good to answer. Too good to fight." Another shoved him from behind, harder this time. The bottle slipped from his hand, crashing against the floor. Laughter erupted as the water spread out like blood, and something inside him snapped. "Pick it up," one of them demanded. When he didn't move, the man grabbed his arm, yanking him closer. "I said, pick it up." No, the room went still. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the old jukebox in the corner, and then the first punch landed. Hard. Quick. It sent him stumbling, catching himself against the bar, but they didn't stop. The next one hit his ribs. Another to his shoulder. He tasted blood before he even hit the floor. "Not so tough now, are you?" The words blurred together as the kick started. Sharp bursts of pain. Boots against his stomach, his back. He curled in on himself, trying to protect his head, but they didn't stop. They didn't stop until the bartender finally shouted something about the cops, and the gang spilled out the door like smoke. He stayed there for a moment, tasting blood and bile, the sound of their laughter still ringing in his ears. But when he finally pushed himself up, wiping his mouth, his eyes weren't filled with fear. They burned with something else entirely. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that the man they had just beaten, humiliated, and left lying on the floor was more than he seemed. He wasn't just some stranger passing through town. He wasn't lost or weak or helpless. He was a federal agent. And they had no idea what was coming for them. But how does a man who's sworn to uphold the law handle something like this? When justice and vengeance blur, how far is too far? And what happens when the truth finally comes out? Stay with us. This is a story you won't forget. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say this: Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism, discrimination, and hate of any kind. We believe in equality, justice, and respect for all people, regardless of race, gender, or background. To our Black viewers, your voices, your lives, and your stories matter. This channel is a space where we confront injustice, highlight resilience, and celebrate triumph over adversity. Now, get ready for an intense and emotional journey that will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our work. Enjoy the story. The sun was setting low over the dusty roads of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Faint streaks of orange and pink stretched across the sky, casting long shadows over the rows of rundown buildings and cracked sidewalks. It wasn't the kind of town that appeared on postcards, but it was the kind of place where faces were familiar and strangers stood out like sirens. It was the kind of town where secrets festered behind closed doors and where the past weighed heavy on the shoulders of everyone who stayed. Jamal Carter had learned a long time ago how to move through places like this. He kept his shoulders squared but his head down, his movements deliberate but never threatening. At 6'2", broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, he wasn't the type of man people ignored, but he had mastered the art of blending in when he needed to. It was a skill that had served him well, especially now. Jamal had been with the FBI for almost 7 years, climbing the ranks quietly but steadily. His job required more than just a badge and a gun. It required patience, discipline, and the ability to adapt. Undercover work wasn't for everyone. It was lonely, unpredictable, and dangerous, but for Jamal, it wasn't just a job. It was personal. He had grown up in a neighborhood not too different from Pine Bluff. He knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to have people cross the street when they saw him coming, to be accused before being understood. He had spent his whole life proving people wrong. First, as the kid who outworked everyone in school, then as the young man who earned a scholarship and a degree in criminal justice, and finally as the agent who never backed down from a case, no matter how ugly it got. But Pine Bluff was different. This time, the job felt heavier. It wasn't just another assignment. It was a town where racial tension simmered beneath the surface, where Confederate flags still hung in windows and barbed wire fences separated neighbors. It was a place where fear lingered in the eyes of people who looked like him, people who had learned to survive by staying invisible. Jamal parked his car outside the bar, an old black Ford that looked like it had seen better days but still ran like a dream. The place wasn't exactly welcoming, faded paint peeled off the walls, and neon signs buzzed weakly over dirty windows, but it was exactly what he'd expected. He had been tracking this group for months, following leads and piecing together evidence. The bikers who ran this place weren't just small-time troublemakers. They were part of a larger network, a network tied to weapons trafficking, drug smuggling, and hate crimes. Jamal didn't have enough yet to bring them down, but he was close. He had spent weeks gathering intel, getting faces, names, and connections. Tonight was supposed to be quick. In and out. He just needed to confirm a meeting that had been rumored to take place in the back room. But he didn't even make it that far. The moment he walked through the door, the shift in energy was undeniable. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned. He felt it immediately, the heat of being watched, of being assessed and judged before he even reached the counter. It wasn't new, but it didn't make it any easier. Behind the bar, the bartender was a wiry man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl. His eyes flicked up briefly before dropping back to the glass he was wiping, as if ignoring Jamal might make him disappear. But the group in the corner wasn't as subtle. They were exactly what Jamal had expected: leather jackets, heavy boots, and patches that screamed allegiance to something dark and hateful. The leader, a man named Wade, sat at the center. He was big, built like a bull, with a shaved head and tattoos that crept up his neck like vines. Jamal had studied his file. Assault charges. Drug possession. A reputation for breaking bones and laughing about it afterward. But files didn't prepare you for the real thing. For the way Wade's eyes locked onto him, sharp and predatory, like he was already planning how this was going to play out. Jamal forced himself to stay calm. He walked up to the counter, pulling out his wallet, but the bartender didn't move. "What can I get you?" "Water." "Bottle, if you've got it." The words were simple, neutral, but the tension didn't ease. Behind him, he could hear the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of voices. "You lost." Wade's voice was loud, cutting through the air like a blade. Jamal didn't turn. "No," Wade laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that made the others join in. "Must be. 'Cause I don't think we've seen you around here before." Jamal set the money on the counter. "Just passing through." But Wade wasn't letting it go. "Passing through?" He stepped closer, his boots heavy against the floor. "You sure about that? 'Cause it looks to me like you're a little too comfortable for someone who's just passing through." Jamal finally turned, meeting his eyes. "Just buying a drink." The room went quiet. And then Wade smiled, the kind of smile that sent chills down your spine. "That right?" He glanced at the others. "Seems like you picked the wrong place for that." Jamal didn't flinch, but he felt the shift. They weren't going to let him walk out of there without making a statement. And the worst part? He couldn't fight back, not the way he wanted to. Not without blowing his cover. So he stood there, waiting. And then the first shove came. It wasn't hard, but it was deliberate. A test. Jamal's hands stayed at his sides, but his heart pounded against his ribs. He could feel the adrenaline kicking in, but he couldn't use it. "Not yet. You hear me, boy?" Wade's voice was louder now, dripping with venom. "I said, you picked the wrong place." And that's when it started. The humiliation. The shoving. The laughter that rang out as his bottle hit the floor, water spilling across the dirt-streaked tiles. He tasted blood before he even hit the ground. What happened next would leave the town of Pine Bluff shaken, and no one, not even Wade, could have predicted the storm that was about to hit them. The pain lingered far longer than Jamal had expected. Every breath felt like a sharp jab to his ribs, and his jaw still throbbed from the punches that had landed harder than he wanted to admit. Blood had dried at the corner of his mouth, but it wasn't the physical wounds that haunted him, it was the humiliation. The memory of Wade's voice echoing in his ears, dripping with venom and arrogance, replayed over and over again. The laughter, sharp and cruel, rang out in his mind like a taunt he couldn't silence. It stayed with him as he sat alone in his car, the streetlights above casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. His fingers clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned pale, but no matter how hard he gripped it, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something far more important than just a fight. He had lost control. Jamal had always prided himself on being calm under pressure, but this time felt different. The anger simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over. He had seen men like Wade before, entitled, violent, and certain that no one would ever hold them accountable. Wade wasn't afraid because men like him never had to be. And that's what made it worse. He hadn't just been attacked, he had been made an example of, as if Wade needed to prove something. It wasn't just about power, it was about dominance. And Jamal couldn't let that stand. Not this time. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty road ahead of him. The only sound was the faint hum of insects outside and the occasional crackle of his radio. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Maybe the anger to subside, maybe the pain to dull. But neither happened. Instead, his phone vibrated in the passenger seat, snapping him out of the fog in his head. He grabbed it quickly, recognizing the name on the screen before he even answered. "You good?" Marcus's voice was sharp, almost accusing, but there was an undertone of concern that Jamal picked up on immediately. "Yeah, I'm fine." Jamal tried to sound convincing, but even he could hear the tightness in his own voice. Marcus didn't buy it. "Don't lie to me. I saw the footage." Jamal froze. He had almost forgotten about the surveillance cameras, the ones he'd set up days earlier to monitor the bar's entrance. They hadn't captured everything, but they had captured enough. Enough to show him being surrounded. Enough to show Wade throwing the first punch. Enough to make Marcus's tone sharper now. What the hell happened in there? Jamal hesitated. He didn't want to explain. He didn't even want to think about it. They made me, he said finally, his voice low. I don't know how, but they knew I wasn't one of them. Marcus let out a string of curses under his breath. You need to pull out. Tonight. We've got enough to go after them. Let it go. Jamal shook his head, even though Marcus couldn't see it. No. Not yet. Not yet? Marcus's voice rose. You think this is a game? You think they won't come after you again? What happens next time when they don't stop? When they don't just leave you bruised and bleeding on the floor? Jamal's grip on the phone tightened. I said not yet. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, almost suffocating, but Jamal didn't back down. All right, Marcus said finally, his voice quieter now but still edged with frustration. But if you're gonna stay, you'd better be ready. Because I guarantee you, they are. Jamal hung up and stared out the window again. The bar was still there, glowing faintly under the flickering neon sign. The bikes were parked out front like trophies, lined up in a perfect row. He could almost hear the roar of their engines, the laughter spilling out onto the street. It made his stomach twist, but not with fear. With something sharper. He knew what he was doing was dangerous. He knew he was walking a thin line between justice and revenge, but he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after what they had done. The next morning, Jamal drove back into Pine Bluff, the weight of the previous night still heavy on his shoulders. The ache in his ribs hadn't faded, and every step reminded him of how close he had come to losing control. But he wasn't there to hide. He wasn't there to run. He parked across the street from the bar, letting the engine idle for a moment as he studied the scene. The place looked the same, worn down, grimy, and unwelcoming. It was exactly the kind of place Wade and his crew would call home. Jamal stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel as he crossed the street. The bar was closed, but he wasn't there for a drink. He walked past it to the garage next door, the one Wade used as his unofficial base of operations. Inside, the smell of motor oil and sweat was thick in the air. Wade was there, leaning against the hood of a truck with a cigarette between his lips. The others were scattered around, but the moment Jamal stepped inside, the noise died. All eyes were on him. Wade's smile was slow and mean. Look who decided to crawl back. Jamal didn't stop. He walked straight up to Wade, ignoring the tension in the room. I'm not here to fight, Jamal said, his voice steady despite the pulse pounding in his ears. I just came to say one thing. Wade raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Jamal didn't blink. You're going down. For a moment, Wade looked stunned, but then he laughed, the same sharp, mocking laugh that had echoed in the bar the night before. Is that so? Wade stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. You really think you're gonna scare me? You think anyone's gonna give a damn what happens to you out here? Jamal didn't move. I don't need anyone to care. The air in the room shifted, and for the first time, Jamal saw something flicker in Wade's expression, uncertainty. It was small, but it was there. Wade's voice hardened. You should have stayed down, boy. Jamal turned and walked out, his back straight, even as his heart pounded in his chest. He knew what he had just done. He had challenged Wade in front of his crew, and men like Wade didn't take challenges lightly. Later that night, Jamal sat in his car, watching the lights in the bar. He could see their shadows moving inside, their voices spilling out onto the street. He knew they were planning something. He could feel it. But what he didn't know was how far Wade was willing to go, or how close Jamal was to crossing a line he could never come back from. The night hung thick and heavy, its darkness stretching over Pine Bluff like a suffocating blanket. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and cigarette smoke, and every distant sound seemed sharper, an engine revving, a dog barking in the alley, footsteps echoing on cracked pavement. Jamal sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. The streetlights above flickered, casting faint halos that barely pushed back the darkness. He stared through the windshield, his eyes fixed on the bar across the street, its windows glowing dimly. The flickering neon sign above the door buzzed weakly, adding to the eerie quiet that surrounded the place. Inside, he knew they were waiting. Wade and his crew, the same men who had beaten him, humiliated him, and laughed while he bled, were in there, probably throwing back drinks and replaying the scene in their heads like it was the highlight of their week. He could picture it vividly, Wade leaning back in his chair, the others hanging on his every word as he retold the story, adding details to make himself look bigger, meaner, untouchable. Jamal had seen men like that before, predators who thrived on fear and dominance. But what Wade didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their time was running out. Jamal's ribs still ached from the kicks that had rained down on him. Every breath reminded him of the sharp edge of their boots, the way they circled him like vultures. The taste of blood was gone from his mouth, but the memory of it lingered, thick and bitter. He had replayed the moment 100 times in his head, how he had stood there, trying to stay calm, while Wade pushed him, taunted him, broke him down piece by piece. And then the laughter. That laughter had cut deeper than the blows. It wasn't just cruelty, it was confidence. Wade had looked at him like he was nothing, like he was already defeated. But he wasn't defeated. Not yet. Jamal shifted in his seat, his fingers flexing against the steering wheel. He had spent the last 24 hours planning, replaying every detail, running through every possible scenario. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Wade wasn't the type to go down quietly. And his crew? They were loyal to him either out of fear or admiration. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that they were dangerous, and Jamal couldn't afford to underestimate them. Not now. The door of the bar swung open, and Jamal straightened in his seat. Wade stepped out first, his broad shoulders and heavy boots making him look larger than life under the streetlights. Behind him, Duke and Travis followed, their eyes scanning the street as if they already knew something was wrong. Jamal's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. He waited, letting them walk toward their bikes, letting the engines roar to life before he stepped out of his car. The sound of the door closing made them turn. Wade's eyes locked onto him instantly, and that same smirk stretched across his face. Well, Wade said, his voice dripping with mockery. Look who decided to crawl back. Jamal stepped closer, his movements deliberate and steady, though his heart was hammering inside his chest. I didn't come here to crawl, Jamal said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. I came here to finish this. Duke took a step forward, his scar catching the light. You got a death wish, man. Or are you just plain stupid? Jamal ignored him. His eyes stayed locked on Wade. I told you this wasn't over, Jamal said, his words sharp enough to cut through the noise of the idling engines. Wade's smirk didn't waver, but Jamal saw something flicker in his eyes, something smaller than fear but close enough to it. You think showing up here again is gonna scare me? Wade said, stepping closer. You really think anyone out here's gonna care what happens to you? Jamal didn't move. He reached into his pocket, pulling out something that caught the faint glow of the streetlight. At first, Wade's smirk deepened, but then he saw it, the badge. Jamal held it up, letting it catch the light, letting it speak for itself. I don't need anyone to care, Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. I need them to watch. For the first time, Wade's expression faltered. Duke took a step back. Travis froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. But Wade didn't move. He stood there, his shoulders squared, his jaw tight, trying to hold on to the image of the man who never backed down. You're bluffing, Wade said, his voice quieter now but still sharp. You wouldn't be here alone if that badge meant anything. Jamal stepped closer, his eyes steady. Who said I was alone? And then they heard it. The sound of sirens. Loud, sharp, and closing in fast. Red and blue lights flashed against the buildings, cutting through the shadows. Squad cars rounded the corner, their tires screeching against the pavement, and Wade's confidence shattered. Duke bolted first, but he didn't get far before officers tackled him to the ground. Travis dropped his weapon and threw up his hands, his face pale and panicked. But Wade? Wade stood his ground, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. You set us up, Wade said, his voice low and dangerous. No, Jamal said, stepping closer. You set yourself up. I just gave you the rope to hang yourself with. Wade lunged, but the officers were faster. They grabbed him, forcing him to the ground as he kicked and cursed. Jamal stood there, watching as the cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. For the first time, Wade's eyes showed something other than anger, panic. This isn't over, Wade shouted as the officers dragged him toward the car. You hear me? This isn't over. But Jamal didn't move. He stood there, watching the scene unfold, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. It wasn't satisfaction he felt, not yet. It wasn't victory. Because this wasn't just about Wade. This was about something bigger, something deeper. It was about standing up and refusing to be broken. It was about proving that no one was untouchable. And as the last squad car pulled away, its lights disappearing into the distance, Jamal knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The back seat of the squad car felt like a cage. Wade sat there, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, his jaw clenched so hard it hurt. The red and blue lights flashing through the window painted his face in streaks of anger and humiliation. He pulled against the cuffs, but the cold steel didn't budge. His breath was heavy, sharp, and ragged, and his eyes burned with rage as he stared through the glass at Jamal, who stood outside, calm and steady, like none of this fazed him. Wade's voice cut through the silence, low but sharp. You think this makes you better than me? You think this changes anything? Jamal didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the car, his eyes locked on Wade. It changes everything. Wade leaned forward, the seatbelt digging into his chest. You don't know what you've done. You think those badges and sirens scare me? They don't. None of this scares me. You don't scare me. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his expression hard to read. That's where you're wrong. You are scared. I can see it. You're scared because, for the first time, you don't have control. For the first time, someone's standing up to you, and it's killing you inside. Wade laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You think you're some kind of hero? This town's not gonna let you do this. You're an outsider. You'll always be an outsider. And when this is over, when they let me out, and they will, you won't be here to stop me. Jamal stepped closer until there was nothing but the glass between them. I'm not the one who's leaving. You are. And when you're gone, this town will finally start to heal from everything you've done to it. Wade's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped lower, venom dripping from every word. You don't get it, do you? You can lock me up, but you can't kill what I built. Those men in there. They're loyal to me. They'll do whatever I tell them to do. And you? You'll always be looking over your shoulder. Always wondering when the next one's coming for you. Jamal didn't move, didn't even blink. Then let them come. Wade's mouth opened like he was about to spit another threat, but the door slammed shut, cutting him off. The car pulled away, the tires grinding against the gravel, and Jamal watched as the taillights disappeared into the night. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just enough for the tension to ease, but only for a moment. He knew Wade wasn't lying. He knew the gang wasn't just going to crumble overnight. There were others, and they wouldn't let this go quietly. But Jamal didn't care. Not anymore. Marcus stepped up behind him, his voice low. You alright? Jamal didn't turn. Yeah. Marcus let out a long breath. You did good tonight. Real good. But you know this isn't the end, right? Jamal finally turned, his eyes meeting Marcus's. I know. Marcus hesitated. You think he's right? About the others? Jamal nodded. Doesn't matter. We'll deal with them. Marcus looked like he wanted to say more, but instead, he just clapped Jamal on the shoulder and walked away. Jamal stayed there for a moment, staring at the empty street, the faint hum of the bar still carrying through the air. He didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because Wade's words stuck with him, echoing in his head. Back inside the bar, the atmosphere had shifted. The men who remained sat in silence, their drinks untouched, their eyes darting toward the door like they expected it to swing open any second. Duke sat in the corner, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been. He still hadn't said a word since the cops let him go with a warning, but his eyes burned with resentment. Travis broke the silence first, slamming his glass down on the table. You see what he did? You see how he played us? We can't just let this go. Duke finally looked up, his voice low but sharp. We won't. Travis leaned in, his voice rising. Then what are we waiting for? We've got people. We've got numbers. He's just one guy. Duke shook his head. He's not just one guy. He's a Fed. You think this ends with us walking in there and taking him out? No. This is bigger now. They're watching us. Every move we make. Travis slammed his fist against the table. So what? We let him win. We let him think he owns this town now. Duke's eyes narrowed. No. But we don't go after him in the open. We wait. We let him think it's over. And then we hit him where it hurts. Outside, Jamal's phone buzzed. He answered without looking at the screen. Marcus's voice came through the line, tight and urgent. We've got a problem. Jamal straightened. What kind of problem? Marcus hesitated. Some of the guys we pulled in tonight. They're already back out. Connections. Lawyers. You know how it works. Jamal's stomach tightened, but his voice stayed calm. I'll handle it. Marcus's voice dropped lower. You sure about that? Because something tells me this isn't over. Jamal hung up without answering. He didn't need to. He already knew the answer. He leaned back against the hood of his car, his eyes scanning the shadows around him. He could feel it, something building, something waiting just out of sight. He had won the first round, but this fight was far from finished. And as the night stretched on, the weight of what was coming settled heavy in his chest. Jamal stood outside the precinct, the faint hum of traffic in the distance blending with the low murmur of voices inside the building. The cool night air did little to ease the tightness in his chest. Wade was behind bars, for now, but Jamal knew better than to let his guard down. Men like Wade didn't just disappear quietly. They left scars, ripples that stretched out far beyond themselves. And Wade's gang wasn't going to let this end without a fight. The doors behind him swung open, and Marcus stepped out, his expression heavy. He didn't say anything at first, just lit a cigarette and leaned against the railing. Jamal waited, letting the silence sit between them. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was low and edged with exhaustion. They already filed the paperwork for Wade's release. Bail hearings set for the morning. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he wasn't surprised. He had seen it happen too many times before, men like Wade slipping through the cracks, finding loopholes, exploiting the system. That didn't make it any easier to swallow. He turned toward Marcus, his voice calm but sharp. And the others? Marcus shook his head. Duke's already out. The rest are still being processed, but it's just a matter of time. We both know they'll walk. Jamal looked away, his eyes scanning the darkened streets. This wasn't justice. Not yet. He felt it in his gut, the unfinished business, the weight of what was still coming. Wade wasn't the type to lick his wounds and disappear. He'd come back harder, angrier, and more reckless. And when he did, Jamal had to be ready. Marcus exhaled a long stream of smoke, his voice softer now. You did what you could. We'll keep the pressure on them, but you can't fix all of this in one night. Jamal turned back, his eyes steady. I'm not trying to fix it in one night. I'm trying to stop it before it gets worse. Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. Just be careful. Guys like Wade. They don't forget. Jamal didn't need the reminder. He already knew. He spent the next few days on edge, moving through the town like a shadow. He could feel the eyes on him, at the gas station, at the diner, even on the street. The people here didn't talk much, but their stares said enough. They were watching, waiting to see how this would play out. Some of them were afraid, others angry. And Jamal couldn't blame them. Wade's influence ran deep, and fear had a way of keeping people in line. At night, Jamal barely slept. Every sound felt like a threat, the creak of a floorboard, the distant growl of an engine. He kept his gun close, but it wasn't the weapon that made him feel safe. It was the badge, the reminder that he wasn't just another man in this fight. He was the law. But even that felt fragile now. On the third night, his phone rang. Marcus's voice was sharp, cutting through the static. You need to get down here. Now. Jamal didn't ask questions. He was already out the door, his heart pounding as he drove through the empty streets. The bar came into view, its windows dark, but the flicker of headlights bouncing off the walls told him something was wrong. When he pulled up, Marcus was already there, along with 2 patrol cars and a handful of officers. What happened? Jamal's voice was tight as he stepped out. Marcus motioned toward the alley. We found Duke. Jamal followed without another word. The alley was narrow, the shadows stretching long under the dim streetlights. Duke was slumped against the wall, his face bloodied and swollen, his hands tied behind his back. He was alive, but barely. Jamal crouched down, his voice steady but low. Who did this? Duke's swollen eyes barely opened, but when they did, Jamal saw something he hadn't expected, fear. You don't get it. You think this is about me? About Wade? It's bigger than that. Jamal's stomach tightened. What are you talking about? Duke coughed, wincing in pain. You stirred up something you can't control. And now we're all screwed. Jamal's eyes narrowed. Who did this to you? Duke's voice dropped even lower. People who make Wade look small. Jamal stood up, his heart pounding as he stepped back. Marcus was waiting, his face pale under the streetlights. What the hell is going on, Jamal? Jamal didn't have an answer. Not yet. But as he looked back at Duke, the weight of what he had uncovered started to sink in. Wade wasn't the end of this. He was just the beginning. The next morning, Wade was released on bail. The news spread fast. By noon, half the town knew, and by nightfall, Jamal felt the shift in the air. It wasn't fear anymore. It was anger. Wade wasn't hiding. He was making a statement. Jamal stood outside his motel room, his gun tucked under his jacket as he watched the parking lot. He could feel it building, something bigger, darker, waiting to explode. And as the shadows stretched across the asphalt, he knew he was running out of time. When the knock came, it wasn't soft. It was sharp, deliberate. Jamal opened the door, his hand already hovering near his weapon. Marcus stood there, his face tight. We need to talk. Jamal stepped aside, letting him in. What is it? Marcus didn't sit. He paced. Wade's out, and he's already making moves. But that's not the worst part. Someone's been leaking information. Names. Addresses. Yours. Jamal's blood ran cold. How? Marcus shook his head. I don't know. But whoever it is, they're close. Closer than we thought. Jamal leaned against the wall, his mind racing. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but now. Now it felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. Marcus stopped pacing, his voice low. You still think you can control this? Jamal looked up, his jaw set. I don't have a choice. Marcus's eyes softened for the first time that night. Just don't lose yourself in it. As the door closed behind him, Jamal stood there, his shoulders heavy. He didn't know how this was going to end, but he knew one thing for sure, it wasn't over yet. And when it was, nothing would ever be the same. Jamal sat in the dimly lit motel room, the hum of the flickering air conditioner doing little to mask the oppressive silence pressing down on him. The faint glow from the streetlights outside cast long, distorted shadows across the walls, making the small space feel even smaller. He leaned back in the creaky chair, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side, his eyes fixed on the door as though expecting it to burst open at any second. Sleep had been impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Wade's face, angry, defiant, and unbroken even as the cuffs snapped around his wrists. That look had stayed with him, clawing at the edges of his thoughts, refusing to let him feel the relief he had hoped for. The sound of a car pulling into the lot outside snapped Jamal out of his thoughts. He stood slowly, moving toward the window and parting the curtain just enough to see. A black sedan with tinted windows rolled to a stop near the entrance. He couldn't make out the faces inside, but his instincts immediately sharpened. He stayed by the window, his heartbeat quickening as he reached for his phone and dialed. Marcus picked up after 2 rings, his voice low and alert. What's wrong? Jamal didn't take his eyes off the car. I think someone's watching the motel. Black sedan, tinted windows, hasn't moved in 2 minutes. Marcus cursed under his breath. We'll send someone. Stay inside. Lock the door. Jamal lowered the phone, but he didn't move away from the window. He could feel it now, the weight of eyes on him, and every nerve in his body screamed to be ready. He checked his weapon again, the smooth metal familiar and steady in his hand. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the car didn't move. It just sat there, its dark windows staring back at him like empty eyes. When headlights suddenly washed over the lot, Jamal tensed, but the approaching patrol car made the sedan's taillights flare as it sped off into the night. Jamal exhaled slowly, but the tension in his chest didn't fade. The knock on his door was sharp and deliberate, and Jamal kept his gun in hand as he opened it. Marcus stood there, his face tight. We need to talk. Jamal stepped aside, letting him in. Marcus didn't sit. He paced, his boots heavy against the thin carpet, and Jamal waited. It's worse than we thought, Marcus said finally, his voice low. Wade's out. Bail came through this morning. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Marcus kept going. And it's not just him. Duke's walking free too. The others? They're on their way out. Jamal felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he forced himself to stay steady. Connections? Marcus nodded. Lawyers. Friends in high places. Whatever it is, they're moving fast. And there's more. Someone's leaking information, details about you. Where you're staying, who you're working with. Jamal set his gun down on the table, his hands curling into fists. How much do they know? Everything. The word hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Jamal's voice dropped, low and sharp. Then we shut it down. Marcus stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto Jamal's. And how do you plan to do that? Because right now, it looks like they've got the upper hand. Jamal didn't hesitate. Not for long. Marcus exhaled sharply. You're playing with fire, Jamal. And if you're not careful, it's gonna burn you alive. Jamal leaned in, his voice calm but heavy. I didn't come here to play it safe. Before Marcus could respond, Jamal's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his stomach tightening when he saw the blocked number. He answered, his voice steady. Wade's voice came through the line like a hiss. You think this is over? Jamal didn't blink. It is over. Wade laughed, cold and sharp. Not even close. You made a mistake coming after me. And now I'm gonna make sure you pay for it. Jamal's grip on the phone tightened, but his tone didn't waver. You're done, Wade. Wade's voice dropped lower, colder. You really think that badge is gonna keep you safe? Not here. Not in my town. It's not your town anymore. Wade's voice turned sharp, cutting through the line. You don't know who you're dealing with. Jamal's voice was steady, but his pulse was racing. Neither do you. The line went dead, but Jamal didn't lower the phone. Marcus was watching him, his eyes sharp. What did he say? Jamal's voice was calm, but his heart pounded. He's coming. Marcus straightened. Then we need to move. Jamal grabbed his jacket and his gun, his movements quick but controlled. Let's end this. They drove in tense silence, the street stretching out dark and empty ahead of them. The bar loomed at the end of the block, its windows dark but its presence heavy. Jamal could feel it, the weight of everything leading to this moment. Marcus cut the engine, his voice low. Backup's on the way, but they're 15 minutes out. Jamal stepped out without hesitation. We don't have 15 minutes. Marcus followed, his gun already in hand. They moved toward the door, the night so quiet it made every step sound louder than it was. Jamal pushed the door open, and the stale air inside hit him immediately. Wade's voice came from the back, low and sharp. You're too late. Jamal stepped closer, his eyes scanning the shadows. For what? For this. The light snapped on, and Jamal froze as Wade stepped out, a gun in his hand. But before Wade could pull the trigger, Jamal moved. The gunshot rang out, but Jamal was already ducking, slamming Wade's arm against the wall. The weapon clattered to the floor, and Wade lunged at him. The fight was quick, brutal. Fists landed hard, and Jamal felt the sting of a punch split his lip, but he didn't stop. He drove Wade back, pinning him against the wall as Marcus moved in, snapping cuffs around his wrists. Wade struggled, his voice raw with rage. This isn't over. Jamal leaned in close, his voice calm but sharp. It is for you. As Wade was dragged out, Jamal stood there, his chest heaving, but his hands steady. Marcus stepped up beside him, his voice quiet. You all right? Jamal looked at the wreckage around him, the broken tables, the shattered glass. Then he nodded. Yeah. But even as he stepped outside and watched the cars disappear into the night, he knew this wasn't the end. Not for him. And not for the town. Jamal sat on the hood of his car, staring at the empty road ahead, his breath fogging up in the cold night air. The lights of the police cars were long gone, their sirens fading into the distance hours ago, but the weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy around him. The street was quiet now, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that felt safe. It was the kind of silence that hummed with something unfinished, something that refused to let go. He could feel it in his chest, pressing down, reminding him that this wasn't over, not really. Wade was in cuffs, but the shadows he left behind still lingered, and Jamal knew they wouldn't disappear overnight. Marcus stood nearby, leaning against the side of his own car, his arms crossed and his expression grim. He'd been quiet since the arrest, only speaking when absolutely necessary. Now, though, he broke the silence, his voice low but heavy. You should have let them handle it. Jamal didn't turn. Handle what? All of it, Marcus said, stepping closer. You pushed too hard, and now you're in it deeper than you should be. Wade's locked up, but his people aren't. They're still out there, and you know as well as I do they're not gonna let this slide. Jamal exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold. I couldn't just stand by and let it keep happening. Marcus's voice sharpened. You think this is over? It's not. Guys like Wade don't go down without dragging everyone around them into the fire. You put yourself in the middle of something that's bigger than him, bigger than this town, and now you're a target. Jamal finally turned, his eyes steady. I've been a target my whole life. This isn't new. Marcus shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. This is different. You didn't just go after Wade, you humiliated him. You made him look weak. And for men like him, that's worse than anything. Jamal's voice was calm but sharp. Good. Marcus stared at him, his eyes narrowing. You really think this is justice? Because it's not. It's personal. Jamal stepped closer, his voice low. It is personal. And it should be. You saw what they did, Marcus. You saw what they're capable of. How many times have we let guys like him get away with it because we were too afraid to make it personal? Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked away, his jaw tightening. And what happens when it gets worse? When someone else gets hurt because of this? Because of you? Jamal's voice softened, but there was no hesitation in it. Then I'll deal with it. Marcus let out a breath, shaking his head. You don't get it, Jamal. Wade may be locked up now, but men like him don't stay locked up for long. They find ways out. And when he does, he's coming straight for you. Jamal didn't flinch. Let him. Marcus's voice rose, frustration breaking through. Damn it, Jamal. This isn't just about you. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. And the people in this town? They're the ones who are gonna pay the price for what you did tonight. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. Then we'll protect them. Marcus shook his head, stepping back. You can't protect everyone. And if you keep pushing like this, you won't even be able to protect yourself. Jamal didn't respond. He just watched as Marcus turned and walked back to his car, slamming the door before driving off into the night. The sound of the engine faded quickly, leaving Jamal alone again with nothing but his thoughts. He knew Marcus was right, at least partly. Wade wasn't the kind of man who gave up. And his crew? They weren't just loyal. They were dangerous. Jamal had seen it in their eyes, the way they looked at him like prey, like they were just waiting for the right moment to strike. But fear wasn't something Jamal allowed himself to feel, not anymore. The next morning came too fast, the sun rising over Pine Bluff as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Jamal could feel it the second he stepped outside. The town felt different, heavier, more on edge. People avoided his eyes when he passed, their shoulders hunched as though they expected something to fall apart at any moment. At the diner, the usual hum of conversation was quieter. Jamal ordered coffee, but the waitress barely looked at him as she poured it, her hands shaking just enough for him to notice. He didn't ask why. He already knew. Marcus showed up halfway through his cup, sliding into the booth across from him without a word. Jamal waited, letting the silence settle before finally speaking. What is it? Marcus's voice was tight. Wade's lawyer is pushing hard. They're calling it harassment, saying we violated his rights. If the judge buys it, he walks. Jamal's grip on the coffee mug tightened. And the others? Marcus shook his head. Most of them are out already. And the ones who aren't? They will be soon. Jamal exhaled slowly, his voice steady. Then we hit them again. Marcus looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Are you serious? Dead serious. Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping. You need to think this through. You think they're just gonna roll over and let you take them down? Jamal's eyes didn't waver. No. That's why we don't stop. Marcus leaned back, shaking his head. You're playing with fire, Jamal. Jamal didn't blink. Then let it burn. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then stood up. I hope you know what you're doing. Jamal didn't watch him leave. His focus was already on what came next. He finished his coffee, left cash on the table, and stepped outside into the sunlight. The town felt smaller now, its streets quieter, but Jamal didn't let it slow him down. He knew the storm was still coming. And this time, he was ready for it. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, and yet the silence was heavy. Jamal stood near the front, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable as Wade was led into the room in chains. The man who had once stood so tall, who had strutted through Pine Bluff like he owned it, now looked smaller, the weight of the cuffs around his wrists visible in the way his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. But Wade's eyes were still sharp, defiant even, as he scanned the room until they locked onto Jamal. For a moment, there was nothing but tension, thick, unspoken, and unrelenting. But Jamal didn't look away. Wade's lawyer leaned in close, whispering something that made Wade's lip curl, but Jamal stayed steady. He'd been through too much, seen too much, to falter now. The evidence was airtight. The charges ranged from aggravated assault to weapons trafficking, and no amount of intimidation could erase the video footage, the testimonies, or the connections they had uncovered. Wade's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was burning from the inside out. And as the judge entered, slamming the gavel to call the court to order, Jamal felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The proceedings were deliberate, each detail of Wade's crimes laid bare for everyone to hear. The witnesses testified, some reluctantly, others with voices trembling but strong. Jamal watched them closely, noting the way their eyes shifted between fear and relief as they spoke. Duke's testimony was the most surprising. Bruised and broken, he took the stand, his voice hollow but clear as he detailed Wade's threats and crimes. When Jamal had found him beaten and left for dead, he never expected Duke to flip. But fear had its limits, and Wade had crossed them. By the time the final arguments were made, Wade's confidence had cracked. He sat stiffly, his fists clenched on the table, but his eyes darted, uneasy, desperate. The judge's voice cut through the room as the verdict was read. Guilty. On all counts. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed, but Jamal didn't move, not even when Wade snapped, shouting curses as the bailiffs restrained him. You think this ends here? Wade's voice cracked as they dragged him away. You think I'll rot in a cage? You're dead, Carter. You hear me? You're dead. Jamal didn't flinch. He just watched as Wade disappeared through the doors, his voice fading into nothing. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Lighter. People gathered in small groups, whispering and glancing toward Jamal, some offering cautious nods of respect, others still unsure of what his presence meant for their town. Marcus was waiting near the steps, his arms crossed, but when Jamal approached, he cracked a small smile. You did it. Jamal shook his head. We did it. Marcus's expression turned more serious. It's not over, Jamal. Wade's in prison, but his people are still out there. Jamal nodded. Then we keep going. Marcus studied him for a moment. You sure about this? Jamal's voice was steady. I've never been more sure. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, interviews, and loose ends. Jamal stayed in Pine Bluff longer than he'd planned, meeting with locals, ensuring that Wade's network was dismantled piece by piece. Duke took a deal, exchanging information for a reduced sentence, and the others who had stood by Wade either fled or turned on each other. But it wasn't just about cleaning up the mess Wade left behind. It was about rebuilding. Jamal spent time talking to people, real conversations that weren't about investigations or evidence but about trust. He saw the fear start to fade, replaced by something else. Hope. The night before he left, Jamal stood outside the bar, the place where it all began. The lights were out, the doors locked, and it felt smaller than he remembered. Marcus stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "You ready to go?" Jamal exhaled. "Almost." Marcus gave him a look. "You gonna miss this place?" Jamal shook his head. "Not the place. But the fight?" "Yeah." Marcus smirked. "Thought so." Jamal turned to him. "You sticking around?" Marcus shrugged. "Someone's gotta make sure they don't forget what happened here." Jamal nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Then keep it safe." As they shook hands, Jamal felt something shift. The job wasn't finished, not completely, but it was enough, for now. Driving out of Pine Bluff, Jamal kept his eyes on the road, the town disappearing in the rearview mirror. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that bar. And no matter where the next fight took him, he'd be ready. Stories like this aren't just about justice. They're about choices, the ones we make and the ones we refuse to make. They're about standing up when it's easier to walk away and pushing back even when the odds are stacked against you. But most of all, they're about finding out who you really are when everything's on the line. So let me ask you this, what would you have done in Jamal's place? Would you have walked away and let fear win? Or would you have stood your ground, knowing the risks? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, Tales of Twist, for more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.